The hallway outside the trauma bay smelled of bleach and tension. It was nearly midnight, but the ER at St. Agnes Medical Center pulsed like it was midday. Fluorescent lights buzzed. Phones rang. Nurses moved fast, barely speaking. Dr. Elijah Ward entered through the staff entrance in navy blue scrubs and an old pair of clogs. His ID badge was clipped to his waistband, partially obscured. He'd come straight from his office on the 10th floor, summoned by a red alert trauma page. He didn't stop to explain himself. No time. As he stepped into the scrub room to wash up, a young nurse turned, startled. "Sir," she said, holding up a hand. "This area's for medical personnel only. Maintenance is down the hall." Elijah paused. Soap dripped from his fingers. He looked at her, then at the door. No irritation. Just stillness. "I know," he said simply. "I'm exactly where I need to be." The nurse frowned. "Then where's your ID?" "In my pocket," he replied. "Would you like me to get it, or should I keep scrubbing so I can get into that, or before we lose the patient?" She opened her mouth, unsure. But before she could decide, another voice barked from inside the trauma room. "Where's Dr. Ward? We need him now." Elijah turned back to the sink. He didn't raise his voice. Didn't explain himself. He just said, "Tell them I'm here." The trauma room's double doors swung open just as Elijah dried his hands. A flustered intern, sweat beading along his forehead, glanced around. "Elijah Ward?" he asked, eyes scanning past him. Elijah stepped forward. "That's me." The intern blinked, hesitating. Sorry. They said we were waiting on the lead surgeon." "You are," Elijah said. Behind him, the nurse from the scrub room stood frozen. Her expression had changed. Not full recognition yet, just confusion. Elijah walked past her without a glance. Inside, chaos. A young man lay on the table, chest exposed, vitals unstable. Two nurses adjusted monitors. A resident clumsily prepared a chest tube. The attending, Dr. Heller, hovered nearby, barking orders but clearly rattled. When Elijah entered, Heller looked up sharply. "Who?" he started, then stopped. "Ward." Elijah nodded once. "What's the status?" "He's crashing. Blunt force trauma to the chest. We're prepping for thoracotomy, but you haven't started," Elijah finished. His tone was calm. Measured. Not condescending, just steady, in a way that cut through the panic. "Step back," he said quietly. And they did. Not because of how he looked, but because of how he sounded. Like someone in charge. Elijah slipped on gloves and moved to the table. His hands hovered over the patient's chest like a pianist before the first note. "Vitals?" he asked. "BP 70 over 40. Dropping. Lungs? Collapsed. Right side. Scalpel." The resident hesitated for a split second, just long enough to betray the doubt still lingering in the room. But he handed it over. Elijah's eyes didn't leave the patient. "You've got to move faster than your judgment," he said quietly. Not cruel. Just a truth spoken aloud. He made the incision clean and confident. Blood welled. The monitor screamed. Then steadied. Clamp. Nurses moved quicker now. Focused. The air changed, tightened. Doubt, though not gone, was pushed aside by necessity. By results. Dr. Heller stood back, arms folded, saying nothing. Watching closely. The nurse from earlier appeared in the doorway, her eyes fixed on Elijah. Something in her face had shifted. Recognition. Not of his name, but of what he was. The chest cavity was open now. The room, once filled with hurried voices, had gone nearly silent except for the beep of the monitors and Elijah's calm instructions. Pressure bag. Another unit of Oneg stat. The staff moved like clockwork around him, drawn into his rhythm. The resident who'd fumbled earlier now stood at Elijah's side, handing instruments without being asked. Dr. Heller cleared his throat from across the table. "You've done this before." Elijah didn't look up. Couple hundred times. It wasn't bragging. It was a reminder. He found the source of the bleed, an intercostal artery torn near the third rib. He clamped it cleanly, quickly, then turned to the anesthesiologist. "He's stable. For now. Let's keep him that way." The nurse who'd mistaken him for a janitor stood just inside the room now. Her arms were crossed, but not defensively. She was trying to understand. Trying to reconcile the man in front of her with the assumptions she'd made less than 10 minutes ago. And for the first time since he walked in, Elijah looked up. He met her eyes. Didn't glare. Didn't smirk. He just nodded once as if to say, "Now you see." The patient was stable. The worst was over. For now. Elijah stepped back, peeled off his gloves, and dropped them into the bin. His scrubs were streaked with blood. His breathing steady. Not rushed, not proud, just calm. The room had changed. Dr. Heller gave a slow nod. "Good work," he said. It wasn't forced. It wasn't easy either. Elijah didn't reply. He turned to the resident, the one who'd hesitated earlier. "You froze. It happens. Next time, don't wait to be sure someone belongs here before you hand them what they need." The resident's face went red. "Yes, sir." And then the nurse, her name tag said Katie, stepped closer. She looked at the floor, then up at him. I didn't realize who you were," she said. Elijah's face didn't change. I know, he said. That was the point. There was no anger in his voice. Just disappointment. And that landed harder than shouting ever could. Elijah left the trauma room without ceremony. No applause. No reassurances. Just silence behind him, the kind that follows a shift too large to name out loud. He moved through the corridor slowly, unbothered by the dried blood on his sleeves. Staff stepped aside without being asked. Some nodded, others looked down. Katie stood by the nurse's station, hands folded tight. She watched him pass but didn't speak again. He didn't slow. Didn't need to. A janitor, older man with a limp and a mop in hand, looked up as Elijah passed. They nodded to each other. The kind of nod two people give when they've both been mistaken for something less than they are. Elijah turned the corner and entered the stairwell instead of waiting for the elevator. He needed the walk. Halfway up to the 10th floor, he stopped, leaned against the cool concrete wall, closed his eyes, not to rest. The stairwell was quiet except for the hum of distant air vents and the occasional clatter from below. Elijah stood there, eyes closed, and let the moment settle. Not the surgery that had been routine despite the drama. It was everything else that weighed heavier. He remembered his first day of med school. The professor had skipped over him during introductions. Twice. Called him Mr. Ward when everyone else was Dr. He'd said nothing. Just studied harder. Then his first residency rotation, an attending asked him to empty a trash bin in the OR. Thought he was custodial staff. When Elijah responded with a precise rundown of the surgical schedule, the man blinked, then avoided eye contact for the rest of the shift. Now, 2 decades later, it still happened. Different hallway. Same pattern. Same silence after. He ran a hand over his jaw, exhaled slowly, and started climbing again. Not angry. Just tired. But not surprised. Elijah reached the 10th floor and stepped into a quiet hallway lined with framed certificates and neutral paint. The surgical wing's administrative offices were always still at this hour. Only the low buzz of computers and the occasional printer hum broke the silence. He unlocked his door and stepped inside. His office was modest, no ego on display. A worn leather chair, books stacked neatly along one shelf, anatomy charts pinned with pushpins. On his desk, a framed photo of his daughter from last year's science fair. She'd won second place for a project on heart valves. He sat down, rested his elbows on the desk, and finally removed his ID badge from his pocket. Laid it flat. Dr. Elijah Ward, Chief of Cardiothoracic Surgery. He stared at it for a moment, then turned to his monitor. There were messages waiting, consult requests, a follow-up on the trauma case, notes from his team. But he didn't open them yet. Instead, he sat back, closed his eyes again, and let the quiet stretch. Not to escape it, but because it was the only part of the day that belonged just to him. A soft knock came at the door. Elijah opened his eyes, turned slowly. It was Dr. Heller. He stood in the doorway, one hand in his coat pocket, the other holding a paper cup of coffee. Got a minute, he asked. Elijah gestured to the chair across from him. Sure. Heller sat down, placed the cup on the edge of the desk, and didn't speak for a few seconds. Then, I owe you an apology. Elijah didn't blink. For what? Heller shifted. For hesitating. For not speaking up sooner. For letting others hesitate and not correcting them. You shouldn't have had to say anything. The way you walked in, the way you worked, that should have been enough. Elijah looked at him. It was never about how I walked in, he said. It's about what people expect when someone like me does. Heller nodded slowly. I know. The silence that followed wasn't tense this time. Just honest. I'll say something to the team, Heller added. You don't have to, Elijah replied. But if you do, make sure it's not just words. Heller stood. Understood. He paused at the door. I meant what I said earlier. Good work tonight. Elijah gave a faint nod. Thanks. Now to yours. By morning, the story had moved. Not officially. Not through memos or meetings. But through quiet hallway conversations, broken sentences in the break room, glances exchanged at nurses' stations. Did you hear what happened last night? They thought he was maintenance. No. Dr. Ward. Trauma bay. He saved the kid. The ER intern who'd stammered at the door recounted it to a resident during rounds. The nurse, Katie, said nothing, but her silence was noticeable. She kept glancing toward the 10th floor elevators, like waiting for something she couldn't quite name. Elijah's name, once just a title on a call sheet, now carried weight, not because of what he did, but because of what they failed to see. And still, he didn't say much. He conducted his morning meeting like always, reviewed charts, signed off on surgical plans. But when a junior surgeon asked to shadow him on an upcoming bypass, Elijah paused. Sure, he said. Then, quietly, you'll learn more watching than asking. The young surgeon nodded, unsure what he meant. He would. Later that afternoon, Katie stood by the vending machines on the mezzanine level, sipping lukewarm coffee from a paper cup. The hallway was quieter here. She wasn't on shift anymore, but she hadn't gone home either. She kept replaying the moment, How she'd stepped in front of him. How she'd assumed. How calm he'd stayed. No accusation. No scene. Just that look. Now you see. It hadn't left her. When the elevator chimed, she turned instinctively. Elijah stepped out, flipping through a chart, not seeing her at first. She hesitated, then called softly, "Dr. Ward." He looked up. Their eyes met, neutral, waiting. Katie stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Can I ask you something?" He nodded once. "Sure. Why didn't you say something right away? When I stopped you, you could have, most people would have." Elijah studied her, then said, "Because I shouldn't have to." Katie swallowed. There was no anger in his voice, just a quiet truth, and that was harder to carry. Katie didn't respond right away. She just stood there, cup in hand, the words sitting heavy in the space between them. "I know," she finally said. "You're right." Elijah gave a small nod, not dismissive, just acknowledging. Then he turned to go. But Katie spoke again, this time quicker. "What do I tell people? When they ask, or when I see it happening again?" Elijah stopped, turned back to her. "You tell them what you saw," he said. "Not just what I did, but what they did, what you did, and what you'll do differently next time." Katie looked down at her shoes, then back up. "And if they don't listen?" "Some won't," Elijah said. "That's not on you." He started walking again, calm, steady. Katie stood still in the hallway long after he was gone. Not because she didn't know what to do next, but because, for the first time, she did. The next morning, the hospital's internal bulletin board posted a notice. Standard format, nothing flashy. Grand round speaker, Dr. Elijah Ward. Topic, perception, power, and the cost of assumptions in clinical environments. Location, Auditorium B. Time, Thursday, 6:30 p.m. No photo, just the name. But people noticed. By noon, word had spread. "He's doing a talk? You think he'll mention what happened?" Katie saw the flyer during her shift. She stared at it for a long time. Not because she was unsure about going. She already knew she would. She printed a copy and posted it near the ER entrance. Quietly, without comment. When someone asked, "Is this that doctor from the trauma case?" she didn't hesitate this time. "Yeah," she said. "That's him." And she made sure they saw the name. Thursday came. The auditorium filled slowly. More nurses than usual. A few interns, attendings, even administration. People who didn't usually show up for internal lectures were there early, quiet, curious. Elijah stood at the front in simple scrubs, no slides, no podium. Just a wireless mic clipped to his collar and a folded note card he never looked at. He didn't open with what happened in the trauma bay. He didn't need to. He talked about systems, about patterns, about how bias isn't always loud, but often shows up in silence, in hesitation, in where people don't look, in who they assume walks through which doors. And then, halfway through, he paused. "You all know what this is really about," he said. The room stilled. "A week ago, I walked into a trauma room and got mistaken for a janitor. I didn't correct anyone. I didn't raise my voice. I just did my job." He let that hang. But the fact that I had to choose between correcting someone's bias and saving a life, that's the real problem. A few people shifted in their seats. Katie sat in the second row, not blinking. Elijah finished without drama, just quiet clarity. And when he stepped off the stage, no one clapped. Not out of disrespect, but because they were thinking. And that was enough. The auditorium emptied slowly. Conversations were hushed. No one wanted to be the first to speak too loudly, to break the fragile awareness still settling. Katie remained in her seat, watching Elijah gather his things at the front. She didn't approach. Didn't need to. Others did. A resident with tired eyes offered a quiet thank you. A surgeon who rarely spoke in meetings said, "I needed that." Even the hospital director, usually all handshakes and pleasantries, stood in silence before nodding once and leaving without a word. Back in the trauma unit, someone had posted a handwritten note on the whiteboard. "Don't assume. Ask." No one signed it, but no one erased it either. Elijah returned to his office, closed the door, and sat for a long time without turning on the light. The hospital buzzed outside, machines, voices, footsteps, but inside it was still. That night, Katie walked past the trauma bay and paused at the door. She looked in, not for a patient, not for a task, just to remember. To remember what silence can reveal, what one moment can undo, and what it means finally to see.